Welcome to HSBC Global Viewpoint, the podcast series that brings together business leaders and industry experts to explore the latest global insights, trends, and opportunities. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes. Thanks for listening, and now on to today's show.
Welcome to HSBC's Perspectives podcast series. I'm Joe Miyake, Head of Banking for Asia and Middle East, and it's a real privilege to have with me today Roberta Lipson. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Of course, you've co-founded United Family Healthcare Group. Prior to that, actually, you also led a business that was the top China medical equipment distributor. And in 2019, United Family Healthcare Group merged with New Frontier Health, and now you are the vice chairwoman of that combined group. That's all very impressive, but of course, even more impressive is the fact that you were awarded the Great Wall Friendship Award, which to my understanding is the highest award Beijing can bestow upon a foreign expert. So really fantastic and really looking forward to getting into the conversation. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
Now, over 45 years, you've obviously seen a lot, and actually US-China relations have undulated a lot over that period of time. But before we get into that, perhaps a little bit about your background. Let's go back to your origin story. So you started off, I believe, in New York, Massachusetts, and really interested in what made you make this jump into China. I mean, I'm based in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, you often run into people who say, I came to Hong Kong for 2 years, I've stayed for 10, 20. But 45 years is a long time. And I think it probably even predates the definition of expat as we kind of use it today. So tell us a little bit about what prompted you to do this.
Right. So partly China's just interesting. But the accident of my being in my formative years, going to university in the early 70s, when the U.S. and China were starting to talk to each other again. China was beginning to wake up after the Cultural Revolution, talking about opening up. And so my early history class about China was translated by the New York Times front page almost every day in those days with Kissinger's visit and Nixon's visit. Yep. And it just continued to pique my interest. And I decided to make the investment in learning Chinese. And once you make that investment, you have to figure out something to do with it.
Right.
So, and as China continued to open up, I found an opportunity after my graduate studies to get a job in Beijing. And it started out a sense of adventure, curiosity, but then seeing what was unfolding in China was just irresistible to me. And the opportunity of filling some of China's development needs at that time was, I saw it as a huge business opportunity, and that caught my interest enough to make me want to stay and see where it would lead.
It's fascinating. I've touched a little bit about on what you've done in the healthcare space, but you've done a lot actually over that period of time, and you've held multiple leadership roles, including you're now the chair of the American Chamber of Commerce in China.
Emeritus.
Yes. And I think the American Chamber of Commerce has about 600, 700 members. And so it provides a very kind of broad perspective of what's happening in China. You're obviously very engaged with that community.
For the business community.
Yes.
Yeah. So obviously this has been a time fraught with uncertainty and concern for the business community. There was a big hiatus in export of expats, if you will, a big reduction in the number of expats in China, and many businesses, because of the practical needs of the pandemic, began to accelerate their localization. And what that caused, it was good in many ways for people's business to get closer to their market when they were in China for China. But it did tend to cause a bit of a hiatus between the Chinese management and the board back home. And so I think a lot of messages did not get across. And as the relationship continued to deteriorate through the first Trump administration and has kept on that kind of downward slide until very recently, it caused a lot of concern for the prospects of business in China. You can build up a lot of bad stories without having firsthand experience. So as the 3 years of the COVID pandemic passed, and then another couple of years of really tense relationship, many CEOs hadn't been to China in many years. They couldn't give firsthand reports to the board, and they kind of lost their link with the expats that used to rotate through China, who understood both the headquarters business and the local business. And so it became very questionable. Should we continue here? Should we continue with the China Plus One strategy and hedge our bets with some investment for our supply chain in other parts of China? The Chinese economy hasn't rebounded as quickly as some of the other economies. So there were concerns about, where is this market going to go without reminding themselves that, in fact, the 4% or 5% growth in China is as big as many other economies in the whole world. Yep. So things got a little bit unpredictable for U.S. business in China. It became politically unpopular in the United States to talk about China as an opportunity or China potential investment opportunities. But this has started changing, and CEOs have started coming back. And for example, this year at the CDF, there were 30, 40 U.S. CEOs of Fortune 500 folks coming back to China.
And the CDF's the China Development Forum for multinationals, right? It's quite actually a huge...
It's a big, important meeting, yes. And pre-pandemic, I think every Fortune 100 CEO would try to come if China meant anything to their business, which in most cases it means a lot to their business. And so they've started coming back. And what I'm hearing people say, they hit the ground and they say, oh my gosh, the economy doesn't look so bad from the ground. And in fact, my counterparts are willing to talk to me, and the government is willing to talk to me. We don't see U.S. companies leaving China so much. There are some, but very, very few. And many, many, many of our members are continuing to expand their investment.
I think that's a really interesting point, because you mentioned it, and we were fortunate to have you on a panel earlier, because there is a perception that, of course, people are retreating from China. But actually what you're seeing is companies remaining and investing further. We also discussed, the Chinese consumer market and how that's accelerated. It was actually a striking distance of being the same size of the US in 2019, just before COVID. It's a bit smaller now, but the fact that it's that close means, businesses have to participate. There's no real option. And so you're actually seeing that through your members.
Oh, very definitely. Yeah. I think for U.S. companies to be in, well, first of all, what's a U.S. company? A multinational is a multinational. Right. And no matter where they're registered or their headquarters are, investors are all over the world, and business, for the most part, is all over the world. So there are basically two kinds of companies that are investing in China. One is because that's where their most efficient supply chain is, and they're manufacturing in China for export, either to the U.S. or for the rest of the world, or for both. And then there's the companies that are in China for China. For example, my company, we're providing healthcare services and to the Chinese market, and the consumer market is huge. And when you look at the aging population, of course, for healthcare, even huger, and the potential is huge. But so the companies that are there for supply chain reasons are perhaps looking at de-risking a bit by doing a China Plus One strategy, finding somewhere else in the world that they can supplement and balance their China supply chain. And the ones that are in China for China really have no choice but to be there, because, as you say, the consumer market is just too great a potential.
Yeah. I'd like to bring it to the healthcare space, which we're beginning to touch on. And you said there's still a big opportunity.
Yes.
You've seen this over 4 decades, so you've seen the trajectory. I think the latest numbers were that the Chinese healthcare sector is about 1.5 trillion of value. Comparatively, the US is 4.5. So it goes to this sense of what the upside opportunity that still remains in China is. But we've also seen decisions by the Chinese government to allow wholly foreign-owned hospitals, which I think is a big move in 9 of the major cities. Yes. And if you actually look at the 9 cities that have been selected, it represents about 45% of overall foreign investments into China. So that seems like a very substantive decision. How do you see that playing out? And is that what you think will really capitalize on the opportunity you see in the healthcare space in China?
So it used to be that foreign investment in hospitals required a 30% local equity partnership. Obviously, there were ways around that with VIEs, or there was, in fact, a period about 10 years ago when it was possible also to do wholly owned foreign invested hospitals in certain cities. So I think it was more of a symbolic decision that just signaled the fact that, yes, China is open for business, and China has been looking for various ways to signal that message. And so saying, yes, it's one more industry off of the negative list. I think that's very, very important. But will it open a floodgate for foreign investment in healthcare services? I'm not sure about that, because healthcare is extremely complex industry. It is anywhere in the world. And obviously it's very, very controlled by government regulations, not only national regulations, but local regulations. So jumping into that business in China is a big decision, and maybe even a risky decision for newcomers. I have to say, our own company, we've been building this business for almost 30 years now. And so we have a deep understanding about the regulatory environment and about the consumer needs and the cultural needs. So I'm not sure that's going to actually open a floodgate of investment. But that having been said, the healthcare market it provides an opportunity for all kinds of industries. For example, pharmaceutical, medical devices, pharmaceutical development, CROs, insurance. And the fact that China is aging as quickly as it is means that headroom for growth is going to happen for sure, because we all know as we age, our needs for healthcare become greater and greater, and the consumer's ability to make their own decision to pay out of pocket for services that the government might not be able to apply is getting better and better. More and more people are choosing to pay for their own health care. So that gives an opportunity not only for various segments of the healthcare services industry, but also for innovative drugs that might not be covered by the social system, or high-end medical devices and that might not be covered by the social system.
And then a little bit about China and the US. I mean, these days, tariff is probably the most used word in these type of discussions. It's a difficult, unpredictable environment. What I was really intrigued by was, as we take that conversation into the health space, you mentioned on stage actually that when you looked at the exposure to the US markets of imports in the healthcare space and analyze whether it was exclusively importable from the US or whether you had other choices, that there were other choices. So do you mind just elaborating on that? Because I think it kind of shows a malleability to the choices that are available as China's healthcare space kind of grows.
Yeah, I think an interesting thing to keep perspective on what the impact of tariffs actually can be is that only 2% of the Chinese economy is accounted for by exports to the U.S. So what are tariffs going to mean there? In terms of importing from the U.S., yes. We took a look at our pharmaceutical purchases, consumable purchases, and capital equipment purchases, and found that perhaps not even 10% of what we use in our operations are exclusively available from the U.S. So I think that China has a lot of leverage there. There's things that are substitutable. But the other thing that I think U.S. has to keep in mind is that China is increasingly involved in innovative drugs, new pharmaceuticals that might be a unique cure to certain kinds of cancers. And I think that U.S. patients and U.S. consumers would like to have the availability of those drugs coming from China as Chinese consumers deserve to have access to those drugs coming from the U.S. So I'm hoping that both sides will wake up to the fact that healthcare isn't a place to have a trade war. That we learned from the pandemic that diseases know no borders, especially communicable diseases,
Yep.
but also cultural trends that we learn from each other bring lifestyle diseases. The whole world is aging, and we need everybody's participation in finding cures to the diseases of aging, which include cancer, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, and to close either of our populations off from the contributions of the other side would be the wrong thing to do.
If it's not exclusive to the US, where are the areas around the world where you can turn to for this thing? As the listeners try and kind of play through, what will the impact be if it doesn't play out the way you'd like it to?
So much now is available locally from China that a lot of substitution can be had domestically. There's also good options coming from the EU and European manufacturers, and even the U.S. manufacturers, for example, of high-end medical equipment, are manufacturing products in China and in the EU, and Chinese innovation is really catching up in many areas, especially in biotech.
So we talk about technology and healthcare. We have to be able to talk about AI. There's a huge amount happening in this space. And I was really interested to hear recently a statistic that 40% of the world's large language models are developed in China. As you think about AI healthcare, like what are you seeing in that space? What are some of your predictions?
Well,
if you dare to predict it.
The opportunity in healthcare is huge, but the opportunity, I think, across all sectors is huge. And I can't compare it to what's happening in the U.S. because I'm not in the U.S. But what I do see in China is an immense amount of enthusiasm for incorporating the resources of these open models to individual businesses. And in our own business, we see it just transformational at such a huge speed. It used to take a doctor maybe a half hour to review a patient's total history and all of their records and the trends of their lab tests. And now we have AI just give them a one-page summary, even back 25, 30 years for any patient, and then look across published literature about input that the doctor should be thinking about before seeing the patient. And it's just transformational. It's transformational in terms of efficiency, but also giving the doctor immediate access to what are the options for this patient, and especially in complex diseases. Of course, we don't just rely on that AI output, but using that output and then putting together a multidisciplinary review team to review it. So the most complex issues will have the options that come from the whole world. So the option that pops out might be there's a clinical trial going on in Mayo Clinic that might be useful for that patient. And we have actually a international medical services division that can put that patient together with our multidisciplinary team to the research team. For example, at Mayo Clinic, we have a special relationship with them as well. And it can bring amazing solutions for people that maybe had to poke around themselves the whole world for months before maybe coming up with that solution for them. From a patient's perspective, it's brilliant new opportunities. From our doctor's perspective, it's not only educational opportunity every time they see a patient, but also an efficiency opportunity for our organization. So it's just so exciting. And then looking at how AI is being used now in drug development and drug research, it's just accelerated the whole process tremendously. And the fact that the Chinese companies have embraced this opportunity so much. I mean, a weekend doesn't go by when there's not a course of AI application going on. And people in China, I'm not sure if this is the case in the U.S. now or not, but everybody I know in China spends every weekend going to conferences, studying, learning new things, taking an advanced degree, and with the rapidity of technology development and change, to be able to keep up with this and to access it and to make use of it means you need to be developing yourself. Yeah. And I see this spirit among Chinese people, and it's just so impressive and gives me so much optimism about the future.
Yeah, it goes back to the potential kind of exponential scale, because I think what China does well is it operationalizes a lot of these capabilities. People embrace it, as you say. And of course, off the back of that is all the application that, all of us really benefit from. I think it's been fascinating to talk to you. We've talked about the China opportunity, the excitement of everything happening within China, and all the possibilities that it brings. So thank you very much for spending the time with us.
It's
and
been
I
a
look
great...
forward to our next conversation.
Yeah,
thank you.
Me too.
Thank you for joining us at HSBC Global Viewpoint. We hope you enjoyed the discussion. Make sure you're subscribed to stay up to date with new episodes.